C'est un grand honneur, un grand plaisir vous connaître.
It's a great honor and pleasure to see you.
Dialogue.
C'est ouvert.
Ok, si, pues ya, sí, on y va.
Sentono tutti? Vedono tutti? Bene. Allora possiamo partire.
Sì.
Allora incominciamo.
Benissimo.
Buongiorno.
Okay, let's get started. So let's begin this first meeting called by President Sassoli, who I'd like to greet. I'd also like to greet the other people who are with us. We have some important contemporary thinkers here with us today who have tried to explain the complexity of the world that we live in. Edgar Morin, who it's a great pleasure for me to greet, and also Roberto Saviano, one of the best known and loved Italian writers, who is known right across the world. Let me begin by giving the floor to President Sassoli so he can introduce this meeting. And if you'll allow me, President, let me recall a great European, Mr. Morricone, who unfortunately passed away today. And I'm sure that all of us would like to remember him with the gratitude that is due to the greats. He was talented and humble and touched all of our lives. Thank you. President, you have the floor. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Fabio Fazio. Thank you, Mr. Morin, Professor Morin, Roberto Saviano. Well, we wanted to launch this series of meeting by inviting a number of people to help us understand where we are, what's going on, and how we should look to the future. Obviously, recalling Ennio Morricone, is obligatory, not only because he's Italian, but he was actually a citizen of the world. He really helped everyone to use their imagination, their ability, and their hearts. And I think that is something that goes across borders. But we don't want to talk about borders today because the COVID pandemic has changed things. There's a before and there's an after. And that's why it was interesting to reflect with people on what we need to do, because we need to bring certain words back to the heart of what we're doing and restore their meaning. For us, for the institutions, for politics, we need to reconcile words with people's lives. I mean, that's necessary. It's crucial if we want to be able to look to the future. But this is just a minor part of what we want to achieve with this cycle of meetings that are being launched today with people who we're very much looking forward to listening to, because during recent months and weeks of pain, difficulties and struggles, I'm sure you'll have been thinking about what's going on. So I'll give you back the floor, Fabio, so that we can hear from Professor Morin and Mr. Saviano, and then perhaps I'll make a few comments at the end. Thank you.
Grazie, Presidente. Professor Morin.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, Mr. Morin, you have this COVID, this invisible virus, that has plunged the world into crisis. This invisible virus has brought into question the very idea of progress that seemed unstoppable the progress that we were taking for granted, that could only move in one direction. And this feeling of omnipotence that we had always felt was ours, the omnipotence of industrial society in a position to construct the world as we see it. We thought that there would be no unexpected events that would interrupt progress. But as Mr. Sassoli said, that we need to redefine a number of words that we took for granted. Go ahead, Professor. Well, I'm a bit hard of hearing, I'm afraid. Shall I be speaking in French or in Italian? What would you prefer? I could do it either way.
Francese.
Je pense que en français, c'est très bien. Ça va.
In français,
French is fine. Well, the question is basically about Europe, isn't it? As I say, I'm a bit hard of hearing. And this computer doesn't produce the sound very accurately. Could you put it maybe in a nutshell? Could you put it in one sentence? What's the question that you'd like me to answer exactly?
Ok, il virus.
Well, this virus has plunged our idea of progress and the future into crisis. It's forced us to review the feeling of omnipotence that we had. Does everything need to be redefined?
écoutez, moi, ce que je peux vous dire...
Well, what I can tell you is that Europe's crisis goes a long way back. There was a major turning point when it appeared that it was impossible to continue to make progress. Where we had the choice to decide whether to go to full sovereignty or just for economic development. So that choice was taken, and we went for economic development, whilst forgetting the political side of development. And that economic development corresponded to an increase in European techno-bureaucracy. And the financial powers latched onto that. Europe's enlargement was necessary after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But at the same time, it led to the creation of a diversity of different elements that are more like centrifugal, that they're pulling Europe apart. You have the northern European countries who always have their eyes on Russia, and then you have the southern European countries that look to the Mediterranean. You've got the crisis in Greece, the inability to find a humane response to migration. But the first reaction of European countries when the pandemic arrived was that each country tried to close their borders and turn inwards. And we don't know if the effort to produce this great mutualized credit line will succeed. So yes, Europe is in crisis, it's lost vitality, and its vitality resides in the hope that a response can be provided. But it's a very serious crisis indeed. What we need is some kind of provisional economic cohesion that we can establish. We do need this environmental side as well to detoxify the natural world and our own bodies. We have to detoxify our cities. We need big investments to try and replace industrialized farming with farm-based organic solutions. We need to replace dirty energy sources with clean energy sources. A big common project could help to revitalize and regenerate Europe. But that is just a hope at this moment, a fragile hope. And I am counting upon the vigilance and the democratic scrutiny of the European Parliament.
Grazie professor Morin. Presidente Sassoli, io rivolgo una domanda a Roberto Saviano.
Thank you, Professor Morin. I'm going to ask a question of Roberto Saviano and then I'll come back to you. Now, Roberto, Professor Morin has said quite a few things that we'll come back to, but do you think that a crisis of democracy is taking place, democracy as we have known it? I mean, I'm thinking of Europe, of course, but I'm also thinking about the rest of the world, the Western world in particular. Do you think this crisis has highlighted the fragile nature of our system? Do you think there's a danger here? Well, yes, you're absolutely right. I'm very pleased that President Sassoli decided to tackle these major European issues that we face, basing himself on intellectual and philosophical debate. This really is an effort to get to the root of what's going on, and it's not something that can be taken for granted. I was surprised. I'm honoured to be here. Professor Morin is a mine of humanism, and prior to all of this happening, he told us that all of this would happen. He said that at a time when democracy is no longer cultural in nature, it loses its purpose, its sense. And what's happening with COVID is something that I've seen happen in the United States. We no longer have a shared humanist vision of how to manage the situation. And I think that has shown the fragility of democracy, and I'm talking about all kinds of democracy here. I mean, there is a link between different kinds of democracy, I think, because we only have one democracy at the end of the day. So what's happened in the United States? Well, social distancing is being seen as a political act. Wearing a mask is a political act. If you wear it, you're a Democrat. If you don't wear it, you're a Republican. I mean, that would have been unthinkable in the way in which democracy was originally conceived. I mean, originally you would have acted together to tackle one of these situations. So I think moving on to Europe, I think one of the main dangers that we're seeing in Europe, the democratic economy, which includes non-European countries which are democratic, relates to the victory that totalitarian countries' businesses are having over the businesses in democratic countries. And this is a new thing, because in the past, non-democratic countries had very weak businesses. Back in the day, they kept their businesses alive by nationalising them, and basically non-democratic countries provided democracies with resources, but that's all been turned on its head. Businesses from non-democratic countries are making gains over businesses from the democratic world, Europe, the United States, etc. And the message that we're getting is that democracy is something for the wealthy. What's important is home insurance, car insurance, and your salary. And if, in order to have that, I have to give up on the freedom of expression, free media, etc., well, more and more people are saying that this could be an appropriate bargain to strike. Traditionally, and in terms of culture and identity, Europe has been different. Europe is not part of a limited vision. Europe looks to the Middle East, it looks to the Maghreb region, it also looks to South America. Europe doesn't have limits on its views, and geographically it looks right across the world. So, to conclude, let me say that I don't think we can have democracy if we don't base ourselves on rights. And rights means looking at how businesses produce their products, how they pay their taxes, how they treat their workers. We need to base ourselves on that, because if we don't, democracy essentially ends up being something that's administrative in nature, but it loses its ethical and political power.
Presidente Sassoli, poi torno da Professor.
Well, Professor Sassoli, then I'll go back to Professor Morin. There are lots of questions, but I've got a specific one for you. As Roberto said, you've chosen to go back to the roots of things. They've talked about a cultural crisis that preceded the economic crisis that we went through. Now, Europe, which I think Roberto defined perfectly in terms of its role, do you think that in your experience as a president of the Parliament, is Europe conscious of its own role? Or do you think that when this is all passed, do you think we'll just go back to the usual multiplied?
Che già abbiamo avviato.
Yes, well, thanks. I think we really have started to move in the right direction. This crisis has brought home to us one fundamental thing, that there's a before and an after. If you think that we're going to go back to the same thing as before, then that wouldn't give us any opportunity to learn some lessons, which I think are very profound lessons. We were simply not used to the idea of dealing with a crisis like this one. We've dealt with crises before. We've dealt with global crises before. But it's always been a question of economic or social life. But here, I think we're touching upon something even more profound. What's happening at this moment in time is that we need to think hard to liberate ourselves from the past. I don't know how you see this, but I've got a strong feeling that when I discuss this here in Brussels with the other institutions, with the member states, when we talk about the kind of response that we could make to the crisis, then this emergency allows us to glimpse some aspects of the future world. Of course, the present one will continue to condition us in our thinking, but something new is emerging. If politics does not rapidly free itself from the conditioning of the past, then yes, indeed, we will simply be taking steps backwards, and this whole experience will have produced no notable difference. Well, where is Europe today? If you look at the responses we've seen in the United States, as Roberto Saviano was describing, there's a sense of individualism that's coming up face to face with collectivism. Romano Prodi said this, that Europe can make the difference when we're trying to match individualism and Confucianism, that we have to get the right balance between individual rights and the rights of the community. responses have been made. Outside Europe, you can see responses going in two different directions. Europe can set the new paradigm. That doesn't mean we have to reinvent everything. I'll give you an example. We emerge from this crisis with a European social model. No European citizen has gone without treatment. In the United States, if you want to go to hospital, you need to have a credit card. It's not the same thing. Clearly, the European social model needs to be reformed, it needs to be reinforced, but we're not starting from a blank page. If you look at the response to the crisis, well, as Mr. Morin was saying, there were a few weeks of uncertainty and chaos, but after that passed, you can see that member states and the institutions were trying to find a way out of the situation. The German Council presidency has stated clearly that either we get out of this crisis together or we simply won't get out of it. This was not to be taken for granted in 2008, 2009. Now, first of all, we said this is a crisis where we need to bring our words and deeds together. The kind of words that we've been using, the kind of language that the institutions have used for years, simply just doesn't make any sense in the current moment. Growth, for example. We're living in a world where we have 0 point something growth rates where the rich get richer and the poorer get poorer. What kind of growth is that? And the same applies to so many other aspects of our lives, to so many different questions, that it's as if in previous years we've been going through a kind of false debate. I mean, faced with the crisis that we have, such as migration, well, there's a chance for a leap forward in terms of quality. Let's grab that chance. In the German presidency program, it says that we should be improving Europe's capacity to respond to immigration and asylum. Well, I'm pleased to see that that's in their program. That's interesting. We should work on it. This crisis has allowed us to a greater awareness of a number of different aspects. It's linked to our own fragility. The fact that we were not in a position to even imagine what has just happened. And we need to improve our cultural baggage, our intellectual equipment. It's very interesting in these circumstances to talk to sociologists, philosophers, writers, to get down to the roots of this whole story. If we want this emergency to simply turn us back to the old world, well, no, I think we should allow us to look forward to what's coming. Professor Morin, when we started these thoughts, well, we started even before the crisis. A year ago, at the start of this parliamentary term, together with the other institutions, we were saying, what perspective should we have in reading the current world? And the response was, we have to save the planet and to feel that we are part of this planet, to feel that we are all together on this planet. And I think it's no accident that the first effort that has been going on over the last few months has been to try and sketch out a perspective, a route that could lead Europe not to be better than everybody else, but to point the way forward. The Green Deal is intended to be precisely this. We've got a huge opportunity before us. We've come through a tragedy, and now this emergency has to be dealt with looking far into the future. Europe has to be capable of assuming leadership, not just political and economic leadership, but moral leadership for saving this planet and getting us to 2030 and 2050 as the first zero-emission continent. That is what is at stake. So I think that we should be focusing our efforts today, all of our efforts should converge on that objective. There's a before and an after. And as I was saying earlier, I don't want to repeat myself endlessly, but there are some things we need to leave behind us. Punishment, humiliation. We can't allow ourselves to fall back into these old concepts.
Grazie. Professor Morin.
Thank you, President. Thank you. Well, Professor Morin, you'll be responding to what Mr. Sassoli said, but just one question. One of the protagonists of this crisis has obviously been Pope Francis. He, in a previous cyclical, had already talked about the issue of having an integral environment. It's what you call a new humanism, Professor. Do you think that this possibility exists? Can our society change? Is our society aware of the risks we're running at the moment?
Bien. Écoutez, alors, une première...
Listen, well, the first thing I would ask is for there not to be simultaneous interpretation, because I have problems hearing it. I'd rather just hear the Italian, if that's okay, because it makes it very difficult to me to understand what's being said if I get the interpretation. But I did manage to understand the latest contribution, so I do have some idea of what you were saying. Well, yes, we have seen and continue to see in a different form a crisis that I would call total or multidimensional. It relates to every individual in their own life, in their behaviour, their life expectancy, the way they live their lives, their civilization, their nation, and it also relates to the planet as a whole. And that has shown us one key thing, which is that all humans have a common destiny. The fact is that globalization is creating interdependence. The speaker keeps cutting out, I'm afraid, a message from the interpretation. The speaker keeps cutting out, so it's very difficult to interpret. I'm afraid this part is not comprehensible. Secondly, we became aware that for medicines, for example, and anything related to health, our European countries are almost fully dependent on China and India, where the raw materials for medicines are produced, but also protective equipment that doctors and nurses need to wear. So this is a second problem which has raised questions. So globalization versus sovereignty. And I think we need to get over this either or, not only by calling on Europe, but also by saying that we need to continue with what's solidarity-based and cooperative in globalization and limit the negative aspects of globalization. So this rapid march towards disasters, because the first disaster is the environmental one, and there are other potential disasters possible, I don't know, nuclear or genetic in nature. So we're living at a very a dangerous time, and the fate of humanity is at stake here. And the fact that we are a joint community is crucial here. I think it should be a European mission to tackle the situation, because we have a universal culture that's been developed since the Renaissance. I would even say that as of Montaigne, my compatriot, and who denounced what the indigenous peoples were suffering in the Americas at the hands of the conquistadores, saying that we Europeans are far more barbaric than those indigenous people. Well, Montaigne was at the root of European humanism, and that's then been reflected in the thought of many other thinkers. So this European humanism needs to be regenerated, because we used to say, well, we're all the same, but we didn't know New Zealanders, we didn't know the Chinese. Now we have relations with all of these peoples. So this community in terms of destiny, is in danger. We're all facing the same dangers. So this humanism needs to be regenerated. So we shouldn't be renouncing Europe and our countries, quite the opposite. But what we should do is put part of our European destiny and our national destiny at the heart of a new humanism. So that's a first point. Secondly, we've been talking about growth. And in the document that I was given, there was mention of the 1970s and zero growth. Well, I think that there is currently a myth about. The myth is that we can have infinite growth in a finite universe. You have to be either mad or an economist to think that. But I don't think the solution is to go for either growth or a lack of growth. It's not about increase or decrease here, because I think what you have to do is get away from the futile side of our economies, artificial desires created by advertising, for example. I mean, what needs growth is industrialized agriculture, for example. What shouldn't be growing is industrialized agriculture. Armaments, for example. But we should also have growth, on the other hand, when it comes to solidarity, the solidarity-based economy, organic farming. Anything that's solidarity-based, community-based, people helping each other. I mean, that's the economy that's appropriate to deal with inequalities. And this is very difficult to deal with, inequality, because you can't deal with it via taxes, because tax evasion means that the wealthy move their fortunes elsewhere into tax havens. Obviously, you have to deal with tax evasion. We could perhaps find an international agreement to do away with tax havens, but what's certain is that throughout history, it is the antagonism between the desire for power from the forces of money and then the resistance of democratic and social forces, which have led to the social welfare state, so a situation in which you have a reduction in inequalities and protection for workers. But currently, this balance is utterly broken. Financial and economic powers, lobbies, are located in all ministries, certainly in France, and are located in lots of the European institutions, I suspect. So there needs to be a rebalancing here. And if that doesn't take place, then obviously we won't be able to do a great deal. Now, obviously, it's clear that what we need is a new political path, and the environmental problem provides a major opportunity here, because just like back in the day, the Roosevelt New Deal meant that large infrastructure works were possible, and that was regardless of the prevalent ideology at the time. Well, it's the same today. We need major investment in clean energies. We need major investment on detoxifying our soil and our agriculture. We need to reduce pollution in our towns and cities. We need car parks outside cities, and all these works which will provide jobs will also lead to less expenditure on health, because a lot of health expenditure is the result of the toxic nature of products in cities and in the countryside. Psychosomatic diseases as well, but various other illnesses too. I think it is possible to live better, and that will mean that things will improve. Prior to the crisis, there were already many associations that were working on solidarity-based agriculture, for example, and that needs to continue. There are now many political initiatives all over the place. They're very dispersed at the moment, but we need to search out this new path, which essentially would enable us to emerge from the dominant economic neoliberal system as we know it. So a policy which is at the service of making the rich richer, but also tends to destroy all public services, particularly hospitals, for example. We saw that it was a European directive that enabled member states to reduce the numbers of critical healthcare beds in hospitals, for example, which caused problems during the virus. The idea was to commercialize hospitals and turn ill people into goods. So this damages the welfare state. And we can see that that's not the right way to go. The right path is a different one, which is at the same time national, European and global in nature. So it can begin with national level initiatives, which are then complemented by European level initiatives, which puts the environment at the heart of its project. And this would then enable us to see a different way forward. But there are also dangers that threaten us. We have to be aware of that. Prior to the pandemic, there was a global economic and political process going on, which was leading to a generalized crisis of democracy. And there were two reasons for that. Firstly, political thought had degraded and become empty of content. And secondly, there was also corruption being produced by lobbies. And from this crisis of democracy emerged states which are neo-authoritarian in nature, I think. These systems began to proliferate right across the world. There is one admirable model, I would say, which is the Chinese model, where you have the dictatorship of a single party that controls everything. And also they have new forms of control in place: facial recognition, electronic monitoring, satellite surveillance, drone surveillance, etc., etc. So these neo-authoritarian states have started to use more and more of these methods. But this regressive wave has taken place in Europe as well. Russia, for example, is not part of the European Union, but it is a European state. They're semi-democratic when you look at their system. Turkey is semi-democratic as well. Hungary as well. Forces that we call populist have been taking over. And all of this is very powerful. Here we have a crisis, but every crisis favours two opposing things. It fosters the search for a new solution and creativity, but it also fosters fear, anguish, people folding back in on themselves, the search for the illusion of security in a military dictatorship, a powerful leader who's going to restore order, and basically leads to voluntary servitude from the people. So crises can lead in two directions. They boost the forces that we want to see boosted, but the danger is that the opposite happens, and the danger has been coming during previous years. There have been all sorts of upheaval right across the world. Popular movements have been crushed all over the world. For example, in France you had the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests. There was already a lot of upheaval. We were living in a world that was already in crisis. I mean, there was this crisis going on, which we tried not to see, the green environmental crisis. There were crises in all towns, affecting all rivers, affecting the entire countryside, affecting our biodiversity. Our forests were being degraded. Our planet's in danger. It has been for a long time. And we're also under threat as a result of that, because we think that we're the masters of nature, but actually we're dependent on it. And the damage that we're doing is, at the end of the day, going to damage us. So we have to take account of all of that and the crisis that we're going through. And in addition, as has been said, and this is something that I've been saying for a long time now, because I've been an environmentalist since 1970, I think that new policies where the environment is linked to the economy, etc., would enable us to see an environmental renewal. And this is something that many of our young people are very enthusiastic about. And it's very interesting to see that a part of many young people are very aware of this problem, which is human and planetary in nature. And then we go back to the issue of human health, the health of humanity as a whole. The crisis that's come from globalization is the same as the environmental crisis, because globalization was driven by science, technology and the environment, which itself was driven by the desperate and frenzied search for profit. It's that what produced technological and economic developments, which then led to pollution being produced right across the planet. And this is leading us to the abyss, because we've seen that as soon as we had technological and economic globalization, there was a lack of understanding between peoples, but also conflict was caused. The Yugoslavia wars, the Kosovo wars, we've forgotten those. The war between Armenia and we've forgotten that one too. There were the conflicts between India and China, dictatorship in India, where unfortunate minorities are being oppressed. I mean, we're living in a terrible world, and the forces of catastrophe are on the march. So we need to move forward, and if this is a European movement, it will be a strong movement. So we need to see regeneration in politics, we need to see regeneration in humanist terms, and then we can rethink our politics. And we need to do that because we're basing ourselves on heritage from the past. Yes, we've had democracy, yes, Montesquieu, de Tocqueville, various theorists, socialism, Karl Marx, a very deep thinker indeed, who covered all areas of knowledge to try and find man's place in the world. But Karl Marx is still valid in certain areas, but there are massive gaps in his thought. His vision of man is as a producer. He didn't look at the emotional side and the psychological side of humanity. Homo sapiens is also Homo demens. He didn't see all the contradictions in human personalities, which mean that the same people can applaud a dictator and then hang him afterwards. To understand human beings, you have to look at the good side and the bad side. I mean, you have to try and develop the good side, and that's key for our education system. I've written several educational works, the 7 pieces of knowledge that are necessary for life, and all of this needs to be introduced into our curricula so that humans' consciences can be educated. There's a lot of reform to be carried out. We've got to rethink things, but unfortunately we're not doing it. And if we don't do it, then all our hopes will disappear into the dust. Many things that appeared in the crisis have led to problems, for example, but there have also been good things that have emerged. There's been a great deal of solidarity seen in many countries, in France, for example, and that's a good thing. During the crisis, we saw that it was key for us to recognise the value of our dustmen, our cleaners, our frontline health staff, people who work at supermarket tills, etc. And we suddenly realised that we can't lead our lives without these people, whereas we can live without shareholders and those who buy and sell shares in the stock market. So we need to look at all of this and look at the people who are at the bottom of the scale, the people that we usually forget about, those who are all too often humiliated and treated with contempt. We need to open up. Europe is a country born of migrants. Every country is polycultural in nature. For example, the people of Brittany, they had their own language. The people of Alsace had their own language, etc., etc. And it's the same thing for Italy, the United Kingdom. All the great European countries are multicultural in nature, and they need national unity. Yes, that's very important in Republican France, but it needs to be opened up to the different components that exist, and among those we have migrants who have arrived right since the end of the 19th century, and they're being more and more integrated in our societies. There are difficulties here and there, massive difficulties sometimes caused by racism and xenophobia, but xenophobia and racism are also fed by crises, the economic crisis of 1929, which led to the Nazis, and then the later crises, which are producing so much racist reflection everywhere. So there's a massive but magnificent task opening up for Europe, and I think that's what we need to look at. Let's avoid all this fruitful exhilaration simply wasting away. All this exuberance that's appeared during this period. Let's try and find the link that means we can join our efforts. Let's not try and find some kind of dogmatic ideology for all of this. Let's just look for a new liberating way based on the economy, on the environment and democracy. And we need to renew our democracy as well, using contributions made by participatory ways of working that'll complement our representative democracy. So that's what I think. That's my contribution. I did write a brief work which is my contribution to this debate, and I think that contains my thoughts. Thank you very much.
Allora, chiedo di pazientare a Roberto.
Well, thank you very much. Now, you're the last leader. Sorry, your last book was a call upon all of us to change path, and okay, people talk about degrowth, but we now need to think of a new kind of growth. What do we want to grow? I think the key thing is that we should put politics back into the center of our attention, not politics as administration, not just everyday politics, but rather a progressive politics, as Professor Morin reminded us. The categories of the 19th century that we'd forgotten about are now coming back in force. And I think that they're a key part of the solution.
Morin.
Indeed, there's no doubt about that. And thanks to Professor Morin, you're always able to give us a very colourful range of ideas that we can build upon. But when we come back to ideas like fraternity, that's something that we need to reinforce. It's fragile and it needs to be strengthened. It's something that we have seen in at this particular moment of time. We've had incredible moments of solidarity right at the worst moments of suffering. But the people that we have been thanking, the people that we that have been at the key to dealing with this crisis, can we forget them? Can we continue to humiliate them? Well, I think that is certainly among our responsibilities, all our responsibilities at this moment. Fraternity is a fragile thing. Strength and bullying and private interests, in so many cases, these are much better at having their voice heard. But what we need now is fraternity. If we want to save the planet, we can't do it without fraternity. We can't do it without being open to other people. We can't do it by just simply closing our borders, closing our walls, closing our doors. We can't forget about the Mediterranean. We can't forget about dynamics that are a challenge. Dynamics that are pushing us towards closure, closing in on ourselves, towards authoritarianism. This is something that we always have to bear in mind. Politics can't be reduced to economics and neoliberalism. That's what's brought us to this point. But now we need to liberate ourselves. In the post-war period, we have to remember that we used other people's money to rebuild Europe. But now we are finding a workforce made up of people on short-term contracts. And I think that to transform all of this, we are going to have to think through all of the implications seriously. we might need to go back to old concepts, yes, but in new ways. Social justice, for example, solidarity. These are key words that we do need to find a modern translation for. So yes, we do need to look to the past too. But we do need somebody to direct the process. Taking on board all of the contributions from everybody, but who is governing all of this? You have to think about the public sector, the public sphere, more widely. Not going back to old terms and concepts, but getting that right balance between individual rights and collective rights. That's something that we need to hold together somehow. The resources that are being mobilized are public money. They have to be used in a very transparent manner to achieve common objectives. And I think that now is the time to think carefully about all of this, to take on board Professor Morin's reflections. They're certainly a good starting point for trying to glimpse what this new phase is going to look like. We have to find our vocation again. We've got a bit lost, but now is the right time to find that vocation.
Roberto.
Thank you very much, President. Roberto. Professor Morin has reminded us of the need to go back to fundamentals. I was thinking about what you told me on the telephone yesterday when you came back from the United States, which is, of course, the country of neoliberalism par excellence. And you talked about your reception at the airport. It seems a good representation of this feeling of fear right now, and a good representation of the capitalist system, which we thought was so solid. But faced with COVID in America, you've got millions of unemployed who've suddenly appeared. Now, I don't know if capitalism is capable of reforming itself, but there's nothing is solid here. So I hope you'll tell us that anecdote that you're seeing at the airport in New York the other day.
La fuga che un pezzo di umanità ha cercato.
Well, you're right. The escape that a great deal of humanity tried to carry out, following what Fauci said about them moving towards 100,000 infected a day. I don't know if they had reached that point then. But loads of people tried to leave the United States, Turks, Albanians, whoever. And it's not so much because they were worried about becoming infected in the United States. It was more that they were worried about the United States self-isolating as a whole. They were worried about being able to get to their countries. And so a lot of these people became desperate. They were saying they didn't want to die in the United States. Everyone was turning to their particular God, calling for mercy. They were also turning to customs officials, etc., and airline companies, hoping that flights wouldn't be cancelled. And we also saw in the United States one of the largest pizza delivery chains collapse after a month of not being able to deliver pizzas. We've also seen all sorts of other crises in the United States caused by the economy having to shut down. As you're aware, the economy is based on debt and flows of money that need to move around. And I think if there's one thing that prevents capitalism from functioning today, it's inactivity. You can lose money, you can lose lots of money, you can run up massive debts, you can not earn anything, and you'll live. But if you stop, then it's all over, and that's exactly what's happened. Shutting down the economy was carried out as a result of an effort to defend life. But I became aware that defending life means defending people's salaries. The problem is that if I want to defend my life, I have to defend my income. I mean, if you say to me, defend yourself physically, but not your income, I don't know what to do, because I am my money, I am my income. The most difficult political activity was to separate for the first time money, career, earnings, and people's lives. For Europeans, not so much Anglo-Saxons, but Southern Europeans, it was probably less difficult to identify life with a healthy body, breathing healthily, and physical health rather than money. I mean, this seems like something that we take for granted, but it's not the case. Well, it shouldn't be the case. I don't think there's anything that I can add to what Professor Morin said, and also to what David Sassoli said when he was summing up, I think. Both said, essentially, either we reform European politics on the basis of European principles, not looking exclusively to profit and offshore business. Well, otherwise we'll be in a very difficult situation. I mean, very few philosophers say what Professor Morin said, which was, where is the money hidden? But there are many places in Europe where money is hidden. Basically, it seems that those who are being monitored in terms of their money is individuals, small businessmen, SMEs, because big business knows what to do with its money. It knows where to hide it from the taxman, for example. Quite legally, they're moving their money to islands, to countries with better tax regimes. And so that's causing problems for the state, because the state can't create an appropriate tax relationship with businesses, so they can't get tax revenue from them. But at the same time, these businesses are made up of people. I think relaunching all of this via no tax zones, for example, in the south of Italy or whatever, then that would be crucial. And that would mean that businesses could go to Calabria or wherever else rather than Andorra. So politically and socially, that's something that could be worthwhile, because it could help our local areas. If you invest in those areas, you get a tax break. And that would develop their human resources in these areas. I mean, if you go right to the roots of all of this, Europe has a great talent, but it doesn't use it. Europe is different from the United States. Unbridled competition and capitalism. Europe is different. Europe is an alternative to that. And that's what it was in the dreams of the founding fathers. The idea was that we will create a United States of Europe, one language out of lots of languages, one currency, many identities, one single police force with many different approaches. This is the dream of Altiero Spinelli, the United States of Europe. We dream of peace in the Middle East and in other regions as well, and all that thanks to Europe. And all of that is possible. It can be achieved. Obviously, though, we can't forget that we are currently an old people's home looking to a kindergarten, because there are many, for example, young Africans all over the place looking to Europe. And they live in countries where things are difficult, and so they want to come to Europe. I mean, obviously, there's also the very valid dream of economic success, which draws people to Europe, but there are other things too. So Europe, in its roots, is an alternative to the systems around it. It's always had the ability to negotiate, and I mean, that's important. Let's not forget that we emerged from the Second World War. So we are negotiators. If there's anyone who knows how to negotiate, it's us. This is our great talent. This is our strength. It slows us down, yes, but it's nevertheless our strength. We are very diverse, and we can negotiate, and this is something we shouldn't lose sight of. But I think using ideals, basing ourselves on ideals, is essential. We can be accused of being idealists, naive, we can be accused of not being tangible, but nevertheless, Europe needs to be united with one government. We need one army, united, genuinely united. And obviously, local independence, that's all important, obviously. But that's what we're moving towards. That's what we should be moving towards as Europeans. I'm European, I consider myself a European, a pro-European, and the dream is to bring together, as was said by many thinkers, Spinelli and others. They dreamed of and believed in a united Europe. They believed in a Europe in which liberal and socialist thought would come together, creating a possibility of a world that could count on individual freedom, the freedom to do business, and also the law. These are things that are usually thought about in history departments in universities. We very rarely get to talk about these kinds of things in the political institution context, because in these institutions it's always about tangible matters, the budget that needs to be contested, adopted, the law that needs to be approved or repealed. But here I've heard Professor Morin talking about idealisms, the compass that guides all our efforts. And this is something that I fully believe in.
Well, I know we're behind schedule. I just wanted to take 2 minutes to just try and conclude. There's so much to be done. In Europe, we have so many efforts to engage in right now. But I think that what we agree about is going back to the roots of Europe. Not just responding to the moment, but looking at what has to be done. Those values are already there for us. We already have them within us. But we have to learn from history. Professor Morin, according to you, 10 seconds. Do you think we're capable of learning from history or not?
Como solo.
Well, I'm a promoter of the idea of complex thought. Complexity is the need to put everything in context. We have to contextualize the object that we want to understand. There's a historical context. And historic means that today is an important moment of crisis in modernity. modernity in the sense it goes back to the 1600s. European civilization that has then become globalized. This kind of modernity is in crisis. So I think that that's the moment we're at. I don't say that we've achieved a state of post-modernity or anything like that. But the question is, we're now in a crisis, how do we get out of it? How do we rethink what modernity means to us? The other context we're in is a spatial context, an understanding that humanity is in crisis. But it's crisis that allows us to make ourselves human. It allows us to understand a common identity and a common through our diversity. So it's important to remember this context as well. Otherwise, we just pick up facts and solutions to immediate problems. But it doesn't show us the path forward. Another aspect that's linked to complexity is internal antagonism. Well, we've been talking about the United States, but there are two of them. They're not just two halves, they're two poles. So there are two United States that are completely opposed among themselves. There's the Obama side and there's the Trump side. They are two absolute extremes. But there are two Frances, two Italys as well. Two poles, of course, with flows and history. Well, sometimes one side dominates, sometimes it's the other. But we have to take sides in those two polarities. The union, fraternity, understanding. Well, eros and panatos. We have to take all of this into account. We have our own internal battle as well, not only in every country, but also in every individual. A battle between the old modernity and the hope for a new civilization that brings out the best of European modernity, but refuses the parts that that need to be rejected. So that's the fundamental problem. The final thing that I wanted to say, well, you talked about solidarity and European civilization. And around the world, we need that. But what we have seen is a degradation of all of the traditional forms of solidarity, the large families of the past, in the workplace. I mean, these days people have small families and then get divorced. I mean, solidarity, concrete solidarity on the streets every day. If you see someone fall over in the street, at times solidarity reawakens. Let's see what happens today. But if you've got a democratic society, then it needs to be cemented together. And what does that? It's a deeply held sense of solidarity and responsibility. The two are inseparable, indeed. If you feel a sense of solidarity, you feel responsibility. If you feel responsible, then you also feel a sense of solidarity. Solidarity and responsibility. They're not only the sources of ethics, personal ethics, but they're also the source of our community. A society without the feeling of participation, solidarity, and a responsibility, a sense of civic duty, well, the cohesion in that society can only be based on force, and from the police, the army. If we want real cohesion, a sense of common destiny, a patriotism indeed, that's a different thing from nationalism. Nationalism is closed. Patriotism could be open. Patriotism is totally compatible with the idea of Europe and a wider sense of what the fatherland could be. So it's a very important idea. But we've lost it. We've lost it in Europe. We've lost it in France. We've lost this fundamental idea of responsibility and solidarity. If we want to regenerate and reconnect, it is possible. We can show solidarity. People who are alone, unhappy, people who are in terrible situations. And things that medicine can't heal. We need a European civil service for solidarity, to help in catastrophes, to help in tough times that happen even in our own territory. We need a political effort to resurrect solidarity and responsibility. That's what seems important to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Morin. Well, before giving you the floor, President Sassoli, I wanted to thank Roberto Saviano, and on behalf of all three of us, I would like to wish Professor Morin a happy birthday. 99 in 2 days' time. So happy birthday, Professor Morin. 99 wonderful years. President, let me give you the floor to conclude. But I think we've simplified too much in recent years. We've seen it as a valid way of dealing with complexity. And here, once again, we're talking about a relaunch, whereas perhaps we should be talking about starting again. And in order to do that, you need a solid basis, a lot of goodwill, and perhaps a very high ideal of politics. President Sassoli, well, thank you very much. Thank you for this almost an hour and a half of reflection. I think it's been very useful for us and also for all those listening to us. I don't think we can tackle challenges such as those that all of us have to deal with now without reflecting, without thinking. We can't try and relaunch politics on the basis of interests. We have to base ourselves on a deep understanding of the issues that we face, of the dynamics that we face. Professor Morin said something that really struck me because I believe it deeply, which was that we need to deal with a new world. We need to free ourselves from the old world, and we need to do it via democracy. There's no other way. We need to use democracy. We need to increase the capacity of democracy, which is a bit unfulfilled, actually, and has been unfulfilled in the past. We need to ensure there's more participation. We need to ensure there's more vitality. We need to ensure that democracy is more closely linked to the lives of people. And that's why we need a new vocabulary. That's why we need to look further than just the European dimension. As Roberto was saying, I firmly believe that our horizons are a more and more integrated Europe, but pro-Europeanism isn't an ideology. Being pro-European gives us an area where we can exercise our friendship and cooperation so that we can ensure that future generations are citizens with equal rights and duties, where political debate within institutions is recognised. That's the area that we need to boost. I mean, we shouldn't be afraid of politics. We shouldn't be afraid of interests and contrasts. I mean, there is an issue which is decisive for Europe, I think, which is that of cutting distances. And that's not just a problem of economic results. That's not what's at stake here. We also need to rediscover the humanism that the professor and Roberto were talking about earlier. There's too great a distance between the north and south of Europe, and also between east and west. Politics can help to cut those distances, but it can't do it alone. Being pro-European doesn't tell you what you have to do, but what it does do is give you the opportunity to work with others so that what you do can be done in a better and stronger way. I mean, we saw this a little bit in 2008 and 2012. Global phenomena were becoming more and more of an issue for us. And the pandemic has shown us that again. They've shown us that everything's possible. A virus can lock down the entire planet. And this produces a requirement as well. We shouldn't be breaking off friendships, but we should nevertheless be thinking about our independence, our self-sufficiency. We currently have a very fragile European area because our heritage is fragile. It can be exposed to looting, to speculation. So we have to be very careful here when it comes to the meaning of our independence. It's not because we want to be better than others. It's not because we think we're superior. It's because we think that we can be a reference point when it comes to defending certain values. And Professor Morin mentioned those which are valid for our democratic systems. And they're not necessarily the same values as everyone else's. I think if during this difficult period we could make the right choices, well, that would be a good thing. I mean, we're going to have to make choices in terms of social policy, economic policy. There are some important choices ahead of us. But if we can go into more depth, I think we could discover things that we hadn't previously imagined. Because the European area and young Europeans, I think, will be able to free themselves from the burden that we've been carrying for so long, and it'll give our young people the opportunity to look at things in a different way, so that so many of the compromises that we've been labouring under can disappear. So freeing ourselves from compromises, looking at things in a new way. We need to boost our fraternity and our European spirit. There are cards that we can play for the future. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you to you, President.
Thank you very much. I think you've spoken very nicely. We have to do the right thing. Just doing what's convenient would be daft. We have to do what's right, not what's convenient. So thank you very much to you. Thank you to Professor Morin. Thank you to Roberto Saviano. And thank you to everybody who's been following this exchange of views. And let's do it again. See you next time. And happy birthday to the Professor.